The Progressive Era, 1900 to 1918. The Road to Progressivism. The Greenback Labor Party of the 1870s had sought to thwart the power of the robber barons and wanted inflationary monetary measures. This eventually led to the Populist Party. While populism failed as a third-party cause, it did have political influence for the next 25 years after its failure in the 1896 elections. Some of the populist ideas that would carry forward would be railroad legislation, the income tax, expanded currency and credit structure, the direct election of senators, the initiative, referendum, and recall, postal savings banks, and a sub-treasury plan. Though populist ideas were geared towards rural life, many of their ideas would appeal to the urban progressives who would seek to curb the power of trusts, political machines, and find social justice. The progressives. They believed in an efficient government, and they believed that an efficient government could protect the public interest and restore order to society. In other words, they thought that the government should be an agency of human welfare. The specific issues for reform were the killing or breaking up or just regulating of trusts, the killing of political machines, improvement of squalid conditions in the cities, improvement of working conditions for female labor and an end to child labor, consumer protection, voting reform, conservation of natural resources, banking reform, labor reform, better working conditions and protection for unionization, prohibition of alcohol, and female suffrage. Thus, the Progressive Crusaders created a reform movement not seen since the Second Great Awakening. The Progressive Agenda. Trusts. By 1910, the wealthiest 2% accounted for almost 20% of total income, and an even larger share of the total wealth. Competition was almost eliminated by an oligarchy of large businessmen, while small businessmen were no longer able to compete. Political machines. Bosses who controlled districts or cities regularly accepted bribes from special interests for favors, and taxpayers often paid the bill. Immigrants were often enticed by bosses for their vote. The result? Immigrants were represented, but white Anglo-Saxon Protestants weren't. Municipal politics was now out of the hands of the civic-minded Americans. The shame of the cities. Urbanization. Between 1880 and 1920, about 27 million immigrants entered the U.S., mostly from Eastern and Southern Europe. Many rural Americans also came to the city, looking for work due to increased opportunities. Cities offered entertainment, shopping, new technology like electricity and plumbing, and anonymity. As a result, living conditions in many parts of large cities were revolting. The city infrastructure was ill-equipped to deal with the population explosion. The population just grew too fast. Crime, violence, gambling, prostitution became rampant. Working conditions were appalling. Women and child labor were exploited. Progressive analysts. Between 1870 and 1920, college enrollment increased 400%. Many scholars established separate social science departments. For example, economics, political science, and sociology. They attempted to analyze human society with the same objectivity that scientists use to study nature. They reflected the growing faith in the ability of people to analyze society and solve human problems. They rejected the survival of the fittest ideology. Many social science professors and students would become progressives. John Dewey believed that education for living and working played a crucial role in democracy. The number of 17-year-olds who finished high school almost doubled in the 1920s to more than 25%. Dewey was a major proponent for public education. Lester Frank Ward challenged survival of the fittest thought. He argued it was natural for people to control and change their social environment, the laws, customs, and relationships among people for their own benefit. It was the role of the government to shape society's destiny. Advances in science. Massive public health programs were launched by the Rockefeller Foundation. Better nutrition and healthcare helped increase life expectancy of a newborn infant from 50 years in 1901 to 59 years in 1929. Pre-1900 critics and others: Henry Lloyd, who wrote The Wealth Against Commonwealth in 1894, criticized Standard Oil and began investigative journalism in the country. Jacob A. Riis, who published How the Other Half Lives in 1890, exposed the dirt, disease, vice, and misery of the rat-infested New York slums, and heavily influenced Teddy Roosevelt. Charlotte Perkins Gilman, who wrote Women in Economics in 1898, which is considered a classic masterwork of the feminist literature, called on women to abandon their dependent status and contribute to the larger life of the community through productive involvement in the economy. She advocated for centralized nurseries and cooperative kitchens to facilitate women's participation in the workforce. Socialists criticized existing injustices. Many were European immigrants who hated the excesses of capitalism. Many progressives, such as Woodrow Wilson, saw socialism as the biggest threat to the United States. The social gospel movement emphasized the role of the church in improving life on earth, rather than helping individuals get into heaven. Walter Rauschenbusch and Washington Gladden were key players in the social gospel movement. The muckrakers. They were journalists who attempted to expose the evils of society. Popular magazines such as McClure's, Cosmopolitan, Collier's, and Everybody's emerged. The yellow press also played a role, especially Pulitzer and Hearst. Lincoln Steffens, who wrote The Shame of the Cities in 1902, and Ida M. Tarbell, who published a devastating expose on Standard Oil, which detailed Rockefeller's ruthless tactics to crush competition, and as a result, in 1911, the Standard Oil Trust was broken up. Another major muckraker of the time was Upton Sinclair, who wrote The Jungle in 1906. The Jungle's graphic depictions of the unsanitary conditions in the packing plant sparked a reaction to the meat industry and led to eventual regulation under Theodore Roosevelt. It inspired the Meat Inspection Act and the Pure Food and Drug Act of 1906. David G. Phillips, who wrote The Treason of State, which were articles in the Cosmopolitan, charged that 75 to 90 senators did not represent the people, but rather the trusts and the railroads, which provoked President Roosevelt to label this genre of journalism muckraking. These journalists raked the muck. Other muckrakers: John Spargo, who wrote The Bitter Cry of the Children; Ray Stannard Baker, Following the Color Line; Frank Norris, The Octopus and the Pit; Theodore Dreiser, The Financer and the Titan. Progressive activists. The city had given new opportunities to women: social workers and secretaries, store clerks and seamstresses, telephone operators and bookkeepers. Yet many still worked in deplorable conditions. Jane Addams was a reformer for women and child labor. Florence Kelley, who investigated and reported on child labor while living at the Hull House. Kelley was also a lifelong battler for welfare for women, African Americans, and consumers. The gains that were made for women and child labor reform: Mueller versus Oregon in 1906 upheld an Oregon law restricting women's labor to a 10-hour workday. Many states secured enactments for the safety and sanitation codes for industry and closed certain harmful trades to juveniles. The Triangle Shirtwaist Company fire in 1911, which killed 146 women workers, mostly girls, helped to spur reform. By 1916, 32 states had regulated the hours and ages at which children could work. Some states adopted compulsory education up to the high school level, and the conservative Supreme Court eventually overturned many of these gains.